I was coming off air last night of Conservative MPs saying Dominic Cummings has given a full and frank account. It's time to move on. And the government would like to move on. Firstly, because this is causing them huge embarrassment and tying them in knots. And secondly, because they've actually got some quite important things to talk about. Next week, the track and trace scheme begins, albeit slowly, but it begins next week. Car showrooms will be open. Outdoor markets will be open. From the 15th of June, we're going to get furniture shops, toy shops, shoe shops, electricians shops, tailors, photography studios, indoor markets, malls. For the 15th of June, most shops in this country will be open again, work in the private sector, particularly for those that are self-employed, acting as sole traders, running their own limited companies. Many of them are desperate, and I mean desperate, for things to get moving again, particularly as the infection rate in most parts of the country is now pretty low. The question with the Cummings saga is it possible for them to move on and talk about these important things, or has Dominic Cummings become a barrier to that happening? Well, today at 5 o'clock, as ever, we have a Downing Street press conference. Health Secretary Matt Hancock in the chair, watching it all and asking a question, indeed, was Ben Kentish. Ben, earlier on today, there was a ministerial resignation. Could you just explain that, please, to LBC listeners?
There was, Nigel, any hopes that Number 10 had, and they did have strong hopes that this would happen, of the story fading today, of it going away finally after days of damaging headlines for them, shattered really this morning when Douglas Ross, a Scotland Office Minister, his constituents, who many of whom had expressed anger that the Dominic Cummings was staying in his post despite being seen, and there's of course an ongoing debate about whether he did, despite being seen to have broken the lockdown rules that many of those same constituents had followed. He was in a pretty damning paragraph, pretty moving paragraph. He said he's had constituents who didn't get to say goodbye to loved ones, families who could not mourn together, and people who didn't visit sick relatives because they followed the guidance. And therefore, he said he could not in good faith tell them they were wrong, and one senior government advisor was right, not how Downing Street would have wanted to start this working week.
No, and 33 Tory MPs so far have basically called on Cummings to go. 9 former ministers, including the one Douglas Ross you've just talked about, 2 select committee chairs, a variety of grandees, and some of the MPs in the new red wall seats. And Ben, also, what will alarm the government? I felt, in a way, the story broke to 59% today, but even more alarming for the government, Ben, Boris Johnson's personal approve rating, this is with Savanta Comres, is down at -1%. It was plus 19 4 days ago, and even worse, overall approval for the government in its entirety, now -2, down 16 points in one day. And on the back of that, just explain to LBC listeners what your question was to Matt Hancock.
Nigel, you're absolutely right. That will cause great concern in the Conservative Party. But my question really was about the fact that it should cause concern for us all, because as we moved into this next phase of the response to this epidemic, then faith in the government, people trusting that they are doing the right thing and following the advice they are given, whether that is social distancing, whether it is going back to work, whether it is the things we need to do, going to shops to restart the economy, and of course following the rules that will come with the new track and trace system being introduced next week. If people lose faith in the government, as you just said, that poll suggests they have to a large degree, then there's a risk that they simply stop doing what they're told and they stop following the guidance, and we have chaos, and that's a very real risk. And I asked Matt Hancock if he was worried about that, and what he would say to suggestions that the government had effectively shown it was willing to take that risk, that potential risk to public health and to economic health, for the sake of saving the job of one Downing Street advisor. He talked about...
I tell you what, Ben, I've got his response here. Let's just listen to it.
I'm not underplaying the importance of the debate that there's been, and as I've said, entirely reasonable that reasonable people can disagree with over what happened over the description of what happened over the weekend.
Not very clear, is it?
It wasn't, Nigel, and the government will desperately hope that people do continue to follow the rules. The problem is their authority in telling people to do so is undeniably dented by the whole saga over the weekend. What they'll hope, and I think what many of us might hope, is that people will use their own common sense to make the decisions about the risks to them and their families, and will follow the scientists, even if they've lost faith in the ministers. But the other interesting finding in the polls that were out today was that 71% of people think that Dominic Cummings did break the lockdown. And my point was really, it feels a bit irrelevant now whether Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock, or indeed any of us as individuals, think he did or didn't. When the public has decided that he did, it becomes much harder to say to people, you must follow these rules, when they can turn around, and as police officers have been telling LBC is already happening, and say, well, hold on, he didn't, so why should I? And that is the comms battle the government now has.
What chance have the police got in Hyde Park or anywhere else of telling people to social distance right now? I know, I get it. Ben, in your professional opinion, over the course of the next few days, will the government be able to move on and to start to talk about the really important things like the economy?
I think if things continue on their current course, Nigel, then yes, the story's just starting to subside. There's two things that could change that. Either a real quickening of the number of resignations of Tory MPs and particularly ministers. No sign of that yet. It's been a steady trickle so far. The other thing is, of course, any new information about what Dominic Cummings did or didn't do, any fresh allegations. But if neither of those things happen, I think the story will start to subside and Dominic Cummings will stay in post. The real question, though, as I say, is what damage has it done to the government, to the policy, and to Boris Johnson himself?
Absolutely, Ben, thank you. And Ben saying, it's beginning to subside unless we get more resignations. I said last night at 7 o'clock, I was 50-50 on whether Cummings would survive. It really depends on public opinion. So far, public opinion appears to have worsened since the press conference. Arguably, if he hadn't done it, it might have worsened even more. I don't know. I just don't know. But, can they move on and start to talk about the economy? The problem is they're digging themselves in so deep that in their support of Cummings, they're beginning not to look credible themselves. I mean, have a listen to this. This was Michael Gove on with Nick Ferrari this morning, and Nick was asking him the question. When Cummings said on Easter Sunday he did a 60-mile round trip with his wife and child to see whether his eyesight was okay, well, the mind boggled. But just listen to Michael Gove's defence of Cummings with Nick this morning on the LBC Breakfast Show.
I have, on occasions in the past, driven with my wife in order to make sure that... what's the right way of putting it?
I'm staggered. I don't know how you're going to get out of this one, but it's going to be fun.
No. I think people who know me would know that I'm not an authority on driving.
It's bonkers. I mean, that is just nutso. Michael Gove is an intelligent person, and he says, oh yes, of course, occasionally I've driven with my wife when I was worried about my eyesight. What is he talking about? So much better to have said, look, it was Easter Sunday, we just got over coronavirus, we went into the country, we sat by a river, I know we shouldn't really have done it, but we didn't go near anybody else. I think people could live with that. This ridiculous defence isn't helping them. You tell me, do you think by the weekend that we can actually move on from this and start to talk about potentially exciting things and important things for millions of people next week? I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I hope I'm wrong, because I repeat, much as I don't like Cummings, particularly as a person, I think in terms of getting the next stage of Brexit done, he is actually rather important, and that matters a lot to me. Let's go to Linda in Bedford. Linda, can we move on and start to talk about the economy and other things?
Well, I would hope so, but I think history tells us that we're not going to move on until he goes. That is the way they launch this boil, and they don't seem to be prepared to do it. Now, what I was thinking about today, I was incandescent with rage when I heard Matt Hancock on the way he treated the journalists as well, not prepared to deal with it. There is a book, which I don't know if you've read, by George Lakoff called Don't Think of an Elephant.
I've heard of it. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, and now if I said to you, don't think of an elephant, what's the first thing you think of?
An elephant.
Exactly. And the example he used
I passed that one, did I? Good.
Yeah. So the example he used was President Clinton with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, when he said, "I did not have sex or sexual relations with that woman." All anybody hears is sexual relations with that woman. So when they say he did not break the rules, and I can see this in the reaction of the public, all people hear is broke the rules. And I think that is what has gone wrong.
Linda, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. So is it the defence that's weak then? I mean, was Cummings just not believable yesterday to you?
I mean, I have to admit, hearing him, he came across really well, and you could understand,
on a human level,
panic.
Yes. On a human level, he did, but
on a human level, absolutely got it. But the mistake he made was not realising that even if he said, if my actions have caused distress to other people or have caused other people to do stuff that they shouldn't have done, I'm really sorry. He couldn't even say sorry for that.
I know.
And that is what comes across, is that this is a man who's so arrogant that he thinks the rules don't apply to me. Now, I was very involved, I used to work at what was the FSA, now the FCA, on the financial capability strategy. And we use behavioural economics a lot. And it's clear that the government is using that a lot, which is why it doesn't, I just can't understand why they don't get this. But, one of the things is, the C in Mindspace is we seek to be consistent with our commitments.
But Linda, if he goes and the press see that as the left-wing press or the Remain press or all the press see that as a scalp, is there not a danger that they go for somebody else next?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I have been on the phone more than I've ever been in my life with a very dear friend over the last few days who is an arch Brexiteer, and she also is incandescent with rage about this.
It's cut through, isn't it? It's cut, Linda. It's cut through.
It's cut through to everybody.
Yeah, I'm afraid. I think you're right, Linda. Thank you. Very interesting phone call. Yeah, and I mean, Mark Wallace, who is the chief executive of Conservative Home, says today Cummings would have sacked himself. And I think, in some ways, Mark Wallace is probably right. I want the government to move on. I want the economy to open up. I want some confidence to come back. Can it happen if Dominic Cummings stays in place? That's the real question, and that's up to you, the great British public. And I think the opinion polls on Sunday in the newspapers will decide Cummings' fate. It's 6:15. Time for the news headlines over the last few weeks as we get questions from members of the public. And generally, I've thought they've been pretty tame and it's probably all been sorted out before. But today there was a really, really interesting question that came from Reverend Martin Poole from Brighton. And he asked this question, but without mentioning Dominic Cummings by name.
Will the government review all penalty fines imposed on families travelling for childcare purposes during lockdown? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Martin. That's a very good question.
Which means I can't answer it.
And we do understand the impact and the need for making sure that children get adequate childcare. That is one of the significant concerns that we've had all the way through this. And so I think, especially coming from a man of the cloth, I think that is perfectly reasonable to take away that question. I'll have to talk to my Treasury colleagues before I can answer it in full.
Got him.
And we'll look at it. And if we can get your details, we'll make sure that we write to you with a full answer and make an announcement from this podium. I think we can make that commitment. Thank you, Martin.
So there you are. That's what you call a gotcha, isn't it, really? And Martin Poole saying, well, look, there are people who will have been stopped in their cars, driving long distances to go and visit family because they wanted, childcare or they claimed they wanted childcare and they finished up being fined. Will they get their money back? And I expect that some of the newspapers will have a lot of fun with that tomorrow. And Matt Hancock completely incapable of answering that one. So well done, Reverend Martin Poole. That was really very, very good indeed. Adam says, this Cummings thing is far from over. It won't be till he resigns. I was prepared to give Boris a chance when he became PM, but my faith in him has gradually disappeared. Cummings has to go, otherwise government cannot move on. Just imagine the cabinet were a board of directors and the public were shareholders. If Boris was the CEO, who would survive, Dominic or Boris? I say this purely on the grounds of perception of conduct and how conduct would affect the integrity of the company. Dominic must go, and Boris knows this, says Nigel in Worthing. This Cummings trip really annoys me. It's a total disregard to all the rules the rest of us have followed. He has to go. Simple as that. Another Nigel. So, yeah, I'm not getting much sympathy. Somebody ring up on 0345 6060973 and tell me that within 48 hours we will have forgotten about all of this and we can move on to some of the exciting things. I say exciting, they are exciting after 2 months of lockdown. You know, from next week, outdoor markets will be open again. Showrooms, selling motor cars, etc. will be open again. And then on the 15th of June, shops will be open selling clothes, shoes, toys, furniture, books, electronics. Tailors will be open, auction houses, photography studios, indoor markets, shopping malls. That happens on the 15th of June. So these are really big, important steps to try to get the private sector moving again, which pubs not yet, I'm afraid, but which it desperately needs to do. Can we get on to a positive conversation about that and indeed about the government's, tracking, testing, tracing, isolating scheme, which begins next week? Can we move on? We're off to Fife in Scotland to speak to Lee, a new caller. Good evening, Lee.
Good evening, Nigel, and nice to kind of meet you.
Very well, nice to meet you. So, of course, we've had the Scottish Conservative Party today somewhat convulsed over this. Do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a nothing story, to be honest.
Do you?
I do. I'm surprised it's got so much oxygen, to be honest. I think everyone's just frustrated. It's been locked down for 10 weeks, and it's just all getting taken out on Mr. Cummings, I think. That's the impression I'm certainly getting.
Yeah, but some of this, look, Lee, some of the stuff that was said yesterday was clearly nonsense, wasn't it? Doing a 60-mile round trip to a beauty spot, sitting by a river to test whether your eyesight was okay. That's just it's nonsense. It's Jackanory, isn't it, Lee? Come on.
The first time hearing the Michael Gove comment on your station when I was on holiday, that was quite funny. I laughed.
It's just pathetic, isn't it?
It really is.
But do you, Lee, I'm interested because, people out there are really angry. Listen to this. I'll share this with you from Harriet, who's just sent this in by text. She says, I am disgusted with what Dominic Cummings has done. I do think he should be fired. However, I do not believe now it will happen. He needs some sort of comeuppance, I feel. Another alternative would be to suspend him for a few months, give him a massive fine. Somehow we have to restore faith in this government. And people like Harriet Lee, millions of people are saying, look, we haven't seen our grandparents. We haven't seen our grandchildren. We couldn't go to family funerals. We haven't seen our boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever it may be. We have abided by these rules, and Cummings appeared. I don't think there's
a correlation between the two, though. I don't think any of that's got anything to do with him travelling sick. You drive 260 miles for the fun of it.
Well, if it's, I tell you what, if it's a chance to be in a very private rural setting.
Nah, I think I've actually had this virus a month ago.
Right.
And I've not been confirmed by an antibody or nothing like that, but I know how ill I felt, and it wouldn't matter where I was in the country, I'd still feel like crap, so...
You had a bad time.
I don't think it's really relevant at all.
So, Lee, you think then we can just forget about this for the weekend and get on with talking about opening up in the economy?
Well, I would love to. But like I say, it's like people have just got their teeth into this and then just won't let go.
Is it just? So do you think it's just a media witch hunt, or do you think it's deeper than that?
Oh, it's starting to turn into that. Even just some of the tones that people were asking the questions we yesterday, I thought were rude.
Oh, yes.
Talking to him like he's some sort of child or something. I thought it was awful.
Well, I think when you offend, Lee, I've been there, right? And when you offend the liberal London media mindset, they do treat you like a war criminal. Lee, if you're right and we can move on, it'll be a good thing for everybody. I'm just not sure you are right, but thank you. Staying in Scotland, going to Musselburgh to speak to Andrew, a new caller. Andrew, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. My point is that I would like to say that the Transport Secretary, Mr. Grant
Shapps.
should say Shapps, or however it is.
Go on.
He definitely had to come out and say something about this new idea that we have of testing people's eyesight with driving along the road, because we've had Michael Gove do it and obviously Mr. Cummings do it, and I think it's ridiculous, and he should come out and say something, because it is pretty bad.
Well, I think some of the police have already said, please do not, go driving to test your eyesight. Andrew, as I say, maybe we could buy into, he was worried about the kid and it was a better place for the kid to go. Maybe, just maybe, we could buy into that. What we can't buy into is this Jackanory story, of doing a 60-mile round trip, sitting by a river in a beauty spot because he thought he had bad eyesight. And then for Gove to defend it. What did you make of Gove's comments, Andrew?
I thought it was ridiculous. I listened to him on LBC, and Mr. Ferrari put him in a really defensive position, and he could tell he was squirming in his chair. It's like, if I could visualise it, I only listened to it, but you could tell he was squirming.
It was so bad, Nick was laughing, wasn't he?
It was jokeable. Absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. Anyway, I think our Transport Secretary should come out and be clear and say this is not the policy that we approve.
Okay, no, I tell you what, Andrew, we will make the call now, publicly, on air, here at LBC. Grant Shapps, Transport Secretary, please tell us, is it a good idea to go driving to test our eyesight? Please let us know here at LBC. Right, Andrew, I've put the question in for you. Thank you for your call. Off to Portsmouth to speak to Alex as a new caller. Alex, is it time we just moved on and got on with the really important stuff?
Good evening, Nigel. Nice to speak to you. Yes, I think it is about time now that we stop looking at the doom and gloom and we start looking at the positivity of reopening up small businesses, high streets, get our economy going again and get back, hopefully, to the country that we were.
Yes, but can we do it? Can we do it if hang on, can we do it if public opinion, in terms of the way the government's handling this, that ludicrous answer by Michael Gove, the unbelievable story about Barnard Castle, if by the weekend support for the government is collapsing, then moving on's quite tricky, isn't it?
I agree, Nigel. Yeah, moving on is quite tricky if we haven't got the support for the government. But I think it's just all about kind of looking at the situation and just be able just to restore some faith and try and move on from this situation, especially the Cummings story.
Listen, Alex, I want us to move on from this story. I am acutely aware of millions of people out there who've been without money for a couple of months and are desperately worried. Many of them not qualifying for the furlough scheme in any way at all. Yeah. Alex, let's hope we can move on. Thank you for your call. Some Tory MPs saying they have been bombarded with emails and letters and messages on this question. Some of it may be organised and orchestrated, but a lot of it is genuine. Now, I have been today back out in the English Channel, revisiting the scene that I did last week, where we saw the French Navy literally handing over illegal migrants across the line into British waters to the British Border Force. I've been back there today. I'll tell you what I saw today in a moment. But for now, it is 6:30. Time for the news. 7:03. I was in Dover Harbour this morning. We left harbour at 3:30 this morning, so an early start. And two things I want to say. One is not controversial in any way at all. And it is this. On the 26th of May 1940 began Operation Dynamo, overseen by Admiral Ramsay, what we now better know as Dunkirk. And it went on for the best part of a week, and 1/3 men, 2/3 of them British, 1/3 French soldiers, were got off the beaches and back to safety in the United Kingdom, albeit without tanks, without equipment, but we did get the men back. And it's 80 years ago today that extraordinary mission started. And one of the really lucky things with Dunkirk was the weather. It was very, very good weather, as it was today. And of course, 800 small boats, everything from trawlers on the beach at Deal to pleasure cruisers up in the Thames in Oxfordshire, went across and joined the Royal Navy on that remarkable expedition. So again, had it not been Had it not been for COVID-19 and the crisis we're in, I'm sure you'd have read and seen a lot and heard a lot about the Dunkirk 80th anniversary today, but unfortunately these things aren't being talked about much. I was there for a different reason, but it does concern small boats, albeit those coming in the other direction. So my big criticism last week was that I uncovered something that had never been seen or shown before, which indeed was that the French Navy, we've given the French 61 million quid to stop illegal migrants coming to Britain, and actually they were escorting these illegal migrant boats out of French waters and handing them over directly to the British Border Force. And at the end of last week, we heard on the VHF the French saying, we will have to do this differently. Well, sure enough, this morning, we came across on the horizon a French boat escorting a dinghy out of French waters. Change of tactics. The French Navy boat was further away from the rib than it had been last time. And when they saw us come into view, they kind of turned broadside on and zigzagged a bit and pretended it was nothing to do with them. We then were the first British boat to come up against that little dinghy. They weren't pleased to see us. They were really quite aggressive, some of the young men in that boat, because it wasn't us they wanted to see. It was Border Force, because they know once Border Force get them, they can stay in the UK. But the big change was that on these ships, they have something called AIS. It's a transponder. So you can actually see and map the route that these vessels take. And the big change from the French from last week to this week is they're now, when they're doing these escorts, turning the transponders off. So there's no historical record of where they've been. And unless you've got great visibility, you can't actually see them doing it. So in many ways, this is getting worse and not better. I think there were 6 boats that in total came into Dover today, including a kayak. Someone on his own kayaked across the channel. I've asked the Home Office for official figures. As ever, they haven't got any. And all of this on a day when we understand that Immigration Minister Chris Philp is talking to the former head of Australian Border Force, because they faced a very similar problem, albeit the boats were coming from Indonesia. They were coming further, there were more people on board, there were bigger vessels, but they had much the same problem, and the Australians dealt with it. So we are now having a conversation with the Australians. I'm friendly with Tony Abbott, who was the Australian Prime Minister at the time, and we will do a big feature on this one Sunday morning when we've got the time. All I can say is, a week on from the expose I did, things in the channel are worse now than they were because it's being done in a manner of absolute deceit. Every attempt made to conceal the truth for us, and it simply isn't good enough. Right, back to Dominic Cummings. And 1 or 2 questions here coming in, for me. Mark from Derby says, Nigel, how confident are you we will get Brexit now if Cummings was to go? Look, I think on Brexit that, and I've made this clear, I really do think that our chief negotiator, David Frost, is doing an absolutely first-class job. There are signs now that Barnier is beginning to sort of climb down a bit on some of his demands on fishing and elsewhere. That's going brilliantly. The worry I have is Cabinet. The worry I have is the influences, the big business pressure influences on Cabinet. Most of our Cabinet aren't leavers. Most of our Cabinet aren't remainers. Most of our Cabinet are careerists. And Dominic Cummings is absolutely certain that Boris has to get the next stage of Brexit completed. We have to be free of this, or Boris in many ways could be seen to have failed and broken his promises. And Cummings sometimes is the strength behind Boris that he needs on an issue like this that is still not easy within the upper ranks of the Conservative Party. So let's say if Cummings goes, I will be very concerned about what that means for Brexit. Concerned. We're going to find out. July the 1st is the really important date by which we have to announce, do we extend transition or not? On Twitter, does Cummings' wife drive? No. Look, the point is, Cummings' wife was going to stay there with the young child. The young child had later been ill. So it was Cummings that was about to return to London. Can we move on? And that's what the government wants to do. And we saw conservative-leaning newspapers today saying it's time to move on. I'd love us to move on. I'm just not sure we can. What does Clara and Crystal Palace, a new caller, make of all this? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. Got lots of sun today in the channel, so I'm very well. Clara, I'd love us to move on and talk about business, but can we?
I think we can. For context, I am a Remainer and no supporter of Boris Johnson's politics or Dominic Cummings for that matter.
Okay.
But I do think that there is a tendency with 24-hour broadcast media to just give way too much attention to, minor error of human judgment, which is ultimately what it is, and that we need stable government at the moment if we want to get out of this, if we want to get Brexit, if you guys want to get Brexit done in a proper manner. Mm-hmm. And I just think that it's crazy that BBC and Sky News were giving, 4 hours of airtime to this, asking everyone their opinion when there is, the Hong Kong protest going on.
Oh, but that barely gets a mention, Clara, does it?
But I think that's a big issue, and I think we're encouraging people to just do a witch hunt on people, and I think that Dominic Cummings explained himself, and I think that if the country wants to, join other European countries who are getting out of this crisis slowly, France is one of them, they just need to move on and stop getting their frustration out on this man.
Well, I agree with you, Clara, but here's the problem, right? I said last night that I thought what Cummings had done was wrong, but it wasn't a capital offence, okay? And you've described what he did as a minor error. Wouldn't it have been better if it was a minor error for Cummings to have said, look, we did on that Easter Sunday make a bit of an error and I'm sorry, rather than getting Michael Gove on LBC this morning, giving that ridiculous interview claiming that he too had driven when he had poor, to test his eyesight. It's not even what Cummings has done wrong. It's the defence of it that is so ludicrous that is keeping this going, I think.
I think you're right to point that out, but I do think that this defense is only maybe a bad response, but a response still to a culture of holding people who work in politics to account on the wrong things. And I think that the media's attention and the public in general should try and scrutinize people for other things. And most people who will ask Dominic Cummings to resign right now will have broken the lockdown in some small ways themselves by not respecting the queuing or.
But they're not making the rules, Clara, are they?
They might not be, but they're human beings, and so is Dominic Cummings.
Clara, you're a very reasonable, very logical person, and I hope that what you say comes to pass. By the way, Clara, what did you make of the scenes, the media, the scrum outside Dominic Cummings' home?
I thought it was ridiculous, and it's really hypothetical and ironic, isn't it, that people who are harrying him for that. And again, I am no supporter of him beyond this scandal, really. But I think it just shows the absurdity of the whole situation.
Yeah, well, it was. I have to say, it was pretty absurd. Clara, thank you very much indeed for your call. Going to Pinner to speak to Shay, another new caller. Good evening, Shay.
Hi, I definitely think this should not be brushed under the carpet, and he should not get away with it so lightly and easily, because the rest of us, like myself, have followed everything that the government have said, including lockdown, 1 daily walks, not seeing your family, not travelling. Now, I have a mother still, fortunately, who had to go in for emergency open heart surgery, and that was the weekend after. So the 23rd, we locked down on the Monday. Mum had an emergency. They called it, that she went in, routine appointment, emergency, all arteries blocked, open heart surgery. She went in. None of us could see her. None of us. Why? Because we were not allowed to travel. She doesn't even live that far. She lives in Finchley. Now, that's 10, 12 miles. We, as in my entire family, were suffering. We suffered because we couldn't see our mother, and it was. And this man is just, you just feel like, it's one rule for one and another for another. And it's like he's made a fool of us all.
When you say, Shay, he shouldn't be allowed to get away with it lightly, what penalty do you think he should incur?
Sack him. I mean, he's so arrogant. He's come across as extreme. I mean, I'm not a big fan of politics anyway, but obviously I've been having to follow him more than before. But it's like, he's came across as extremely arrogant, and when he was asked yesterday about resignation, he's obviously not given it a second thought, because he's got the backup from his blue boys. It's almost like they're almost like a big gang.
Shay, you say that you don't normally get too engaged or too animated by political stories. I mean, how angry are you? I mean, what was the last story that made you feel like this?
This one.
This one.
Oh, hold on, I'll tell you. The scientist as well. How about the scientist who had his mistress coming over to his house on a regular basis?
Okay.
The whole it's practice what you preach. And no, why should we forget about it in 48 hours? Because that's exactly what's probably going to happen.
Well,
because clearly Boris and Gove.
Actually, Shay, I don't think it is going to go away. Actually, I in some ways wish it would, because I do think the economy is important, but I don't think this will go away. Shay, thank you very much indeed for your call. Joe in Surrey says it's not going away. The arrogance of Hancock today is typical of this government. The public are sick of it. We're in for a difficult few days with the sounds of it. It is now 6:45. Time for the news headlines with Thomas Watts.
The Health Secretary says the government will look at lockdown fines issued to families travelling for childcare purposes. The government
seems to be too much anger for us to be able to move on. And that anger is being transmitted to Conservative MPs, and they are beginning, in increasing numbers, to say they think Cummings ought to go. And it's very difficult for us to talk about the economy and moving on until this issue is resolved. I got this. My wife had a miscarriage in late April. We have an autistic son and asked if we can leave him with my parents to be looked after while we attend the hospital. We were advised to bring him to the hospital with us. Where was the unique common sense childcare situation during my ordeal? We had to bring an anxious autistic child to us with hospital whilst my wife was being scanned, says Mark. Patrick makes a behavioural comment. We've had some lockdown issues with morons in our cul-de-sac, Nigel, and yesterday there was a large street party at the end of the road, a huge banquet, a couple of dozen garden chairs, absolutely no social distancing whatsoever. Thanks, Dominic Cummings, says Patrick in Guildford. Well, Patrick, it certainly hasn't helped. If Dominic Cummings does get sacked, will that stop all these people flouting lockdown rules? No, it won't. It won't. But here's the point again, all right? A lot of people have broken lockdown rules. Huge numbers of people in some way may have broken lockdown rules, but they're not the person making the rules. And that's why in Scotland, Catherine Calderwood, the Scottish Chief Medical Officer, resigned on the spot when it was found she'd been to her second home on the Scottish coast. It's why Professor Neil Ferguson, he of the famed modelling, resigned when his girlfriend, mistress, whatever, had come to see him at his house a couple of times against lockdown rules. So 2 senior people in this country who were part of making the rules resigned immediately when they themselves were seen to be in breach of them. Dominic Cummings has not done that, all right? An interesting comment was just made to me that for the last 3 days, the 2 real big cheeses that stand there with the Prime Minister when he turns up, or with cabinet ministers, and I'm talking about Chief Scientific Officer Patrick Vallance and, of course, the Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty. Both of these guys were involved in setting the lockdown rules, and neither of them has now been seen for the last 3 days, presumably because they want to avoid the question of did Dominic Cummings break lockdown rules. And we know that Whitty and Vallance are a lot more straightforward in answering the questions that are put to them than people like Matt Hancock. We're going to Clacton-on-Sea to speak to Peter, a new caller. Peter, good evening.
Hello there, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call, mate.
Not one bit. I saw a long-standing GP in Clacton had died, and big scenes in the high street the other day. And I know it's a very close-knit community out there, Peter, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we're all big fans of you here as well, Nigel.
I've always done well in Clacton, I know. It's a sort of Brexit on sea, really, isn't it? But
yeah.
And of course, Peter, let's remember, that Dominic Cummings, he may have come into the whole Brexit process relatively late, but he's been a really important part of it, Peter, hasn't he?
Absolutely. And I think really this is, just really a distraction from the main issues that are facing the British public at the moment. It just seems straight out of the Trump playbook of coming up with some issue, talking about it, and just getting people distracted from what's really going on.
So do you think the media have a fair degree of responsibility here?
They've absolutely been fanning the flames of this the whole time. I mean, I don't know if you saw the photos of them piling outside his house, not socially distancing one bit. awful. It's really good that you're looking so well in spite of all of this, Nigel.
I'm probably the fittest I've ever been, Peter. Well, not at least about 30 years. But Peter,
Yeah, I know they say the camerade's £10, but I didn't realise it was £10 of grease on your face.
well, there you are, sun cream probably. Peter, what? You want us to move on. You think the media have overdone this, but tell me. He's gone. Let's go to Rupesh in Hounslow. Rupesh, hello.
Hi there.
Hi there. Right, so can we move on, Rupesh, to really important economic issues?
No, we can't. Not at this story. I've been hooked on this story since it broke.
Right.
On Friday, and I'm just in shock.
Are you normally, Rupesh, a political junkie?
No, I'm not. But I hover. Mm-hmm. But this story's got me hooked because it's just the sheer arrogance of it all. You know, the British public are following the rules, and then you've got a key advisor to the government clearly flouting the rules. Yeah, I mean, it was cringe. It was embarrassing. That interview, his interview was embarrassing. The answers he was giving.
Well, I think on the Barnard Castle thing, yeah.
With the castle, I mean, I've never heard of someone saying, "Oh, I wanted to test my eyesight, so I took a drive in the car."
Well, actually, Rupesh, it's the other way around. I mean, Brett just makes this point to me on Twitter. He says, "I've never heard anything so reckless. You have to be able to read a number plate at 20 yards to pass the driving test." Well, it is clearly a ridiculous thing to have said.
It's just shocking, and I feel quite upset because I'm a big supporter. I'm a fan of Boris, but now I'm thinking, well, I'm going to start thinking differently now because, my last main point I want to make here is I actually feel sorry for the police now because actually everyone that they're going to stop, everyone that they're going to,
they're all going to say the same thing, aren't they?
They're all going to say the same thing.
Yeah, I know. Well, Rupesh, you must have been very motivated by this. It's the first time you've called us, and thank you. And call us again, please. Next time you feel energised, and that applies to all of you. A lot of you think, I don't ring up radio phone-ins, but if something really gets you and you feel it's important, you want to get off your chest, it's 0345 6060 973. And as you can hear, we get some regulars, but it's nearly all new callers, including Judah from Manchester, a new caller. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Nigel. Big fan of the show.
Good. Well, very good to have you on. Your chance to contribute.
Thank you. I just have a few points to make.
Go on.
I think this is a media personal vendetta against Cummings, actually. I do think that we should move on. Because if you actually look at the dates, this story happened quite a few weeks ago, and the media actually conveniently decided to bring it up now. And number two, if you look at it, the letter of the law, it does say that in exceptional circumstances you can do that. And to all those people that said, "What about me?" they could have done the same thing.
Okay.
Well, if you look at all the videos of the media online harassing him outside his house, I don't see much social distancing over there. So I think it's a bit.
That I agree. On the role of the media, I agree. I want to just answer those 2 points you've made, Judah. Number one, you talked about the vendetta, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's a good rule in life. On the way up in life, don't alienate everybody, because when you fall, there's no one to catch you. And the one thing that Cummings has been brilliant at is to insult and offend almost everybody on his way up. And it's why he's got so few friends. It's why even within Parliament, this cuts across Brexiteers and Remainers, all right? And I think that's a really, really important thing to understand. He's been so willfully offensive, not just to the media, but to many in the Conservative Party too.
Would you say willfully offensive, or would you say he's just taken a different strategy, because knowing that the media often have a very left-wing...
He enjoys... Look, I do a bit too. He enjoys winding people up, He really, really does enjoy winding people up. Do you think, Judah, in your view, Is he still, I mean, because it's going to be the next few days that decide this, and the next few days that decide whether we can put this behind us with him in office and move on. Do you think he'll still be there next Monday?
I think so, because I think if he didn't break the letter of the law, like you pointed out, the other two people, what's his name, Professor Ferguson and Chief Medical Officer in Scotland, they clearly broke lockdown laws. I think if someone didn't clearly break the lockdown laws, I do take the point that in the spirit of the law, he may have done it, but is that enough for a resignation of someone that high up in government?
It's a very good question. I'm going to take one more quick caller. Ray from Liverpool, who's a new caller. Ray, good evening.
Yeah, hi.
So, Ray, tell me, can we move on and start talking about the economy, or is this going to drag on and drag the government down and in the end get rid of Cummings?
At the end of the day, over 38,000 people have lost their life to this coronavirus. And yes, it would be lovely to move on and move forward and go that way. But what he did, I feel strongly about, and he should be fired. It's not one rule for them and another rule for everybody else.
Ray, thank you. Very short, very sweet. You put it beautifully. Thank you. Your point of view was there. Gosh, we do need to move on, but can we? It's going to be very difficult in my view. I'll be back tomorrow.
We say, and I ask you to say with us, lift up your voices in this great meeting in the heart of England, and to all the world a message: England lives and marches on.